Past and Present is the title of this year's edition of Global Access. Is it possible to draw conclusions from past events? Or is man doomed to repeat the mistakes of yesterday? How do authoritarian regimes use their own country's history to secure power? And what role does the individual play? In these interviews, researchers, journalists and writers try to answer these questions. Adam Smith is one of the most important thinkers of economics, and his significance for our understanding of the modern economy cannot be underestimated. Jesse Norman, British politician and member of the House of Commons, talks with Matthias Hesseros about the legacy of Smith and how his thoughts should be understood in our time.
Jesse, tell me about Adam Smith's background and upbringing. What do we need to know about him to better understand his thinking?
So he's born in 1723 and he dies in 1790. That is to say, he's born when Scotland is still coming out of a period of great poverty. There had been famines in Scotland in the year 1690, or in the 1690s, and then under severe economic pressure, it had merged with England under one union in 1707. So there was a lot of economic change coming out of that. And that change is something that Smith lives through in the early part of his life. And there's a lot of religious conflict as well. Then by the end of his life, you see the French Revolution just getting underway, another incredible moment of change. And in between, more or less continuous change of different kinds. So you have the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, and then you have the American Revolutionary War after 1776. And all of those things become important items that he's trying to think about and to understand in his wider theorizing.
And he also lives through an extremely dynamic era, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you looked at the global, as it were, GDP per head, basically exactly the same for 500 years, then you get the Black Death, and it goes up because the Black Death kills quite a lot of people, and that raises real GDP per head. There aren't so many heads to spread the GDP around, and then it comes down again. Then you get to the year 1600. Between 1600 and 1700, it roughly doubles. Between the middle of the 18th century, so 1750 to 1950, a little bit later, 1780 to 1980, it goes up by 30 times. So the pattern is this. And the question is, why is that happening? What's going on?
Yeah.
And Smith has a magnificent and comprehensive answer to that, and it's not by any means just an economic answer.
So what are the foundations of Smith's thinking, would you say? Well, you know, if we can try to describe it.
Sure. So I think the way to go to think about that is to start with Hume himself. So in the Treatise of Human Nature, Hume's great philosophical masterwork, he says that his aim is to found what he calls a science of man. And a science of man is a theory of human behavior in all its different aspects. It might be a philosophy of nature, but it might also be human political behavior, it might be economic, it might be cultural, artistic. That's what might be involved in the science of man. And Hume doesn't really develop that thought particularly.
Sounds like behavioural sciences almost.
Well, what is so fascinating is that it isn't a view that's, as it were, comes out of a particular religious tradition. It's not designed to be founded as Aquinas had founded a Catholic philosophy on the interaction between Catholic doctrine and Aristotle. That's the great Aquinian synthesis. Yeah. What Smith, following Hume, does, and what Hume does, is to sever that connection with religion. So you don't have religious premises. You don't have to believe in God in order to accept their theory. It's a very radical moment in, as it were, British intellectual history. Well, Hume, we don't know. He was always regarded as being an atheist in his own time. Smith, we also don't know. So I don't think Smith is an atheist. I mean, Smith is a believer. It's not at all clear what he's a believer in. His mother was a very devout Presbyterian, and he spent his almost entire life living with her. He was a very retiring man, but he seems to have had a much more eclectic and even potentially stoic, in part, view of religion. So he doesn't, and of course his view of religion is divided into different things. One would be a sense of the Almighty God, but another would be an attitude towards the churches, and Smith and Hume have a big disagreement about the churches. Hume has a wonderful view, which is that It's very important for England to have a national church, as it did when Henry VIII asserted his supremacy over the church and broke with Rome, because, broadly speaking, in Hume's view, when anything is nationalised, it becomes weak, inert and ineffective. And that's a good place, he thinks, for religion to be, because it discourages zealots and religious enthusiasm. That view looks frighteningly prescient today. But Smith doesn't have that view. Smith has the opposite view, actually. Smith thinks that religion should be disestablished, churches should be disestablished, and he thinks it's the competition between churches that will restrain people from, as it were, too much power. Now, I think we can say with some certainty that Hume gets the better of that argument, because it doesn't look like churches are any different from private companies, in that if people can maintain authority over others and, as it were, achieve through their passions and their energy and their projection a certain kind of religious enthusiasm that is inspiring to others, they will do that, and that's what we've seen in many ways recently.
We see Smith as the sort of the founding father of economics in many ways, and what is sort of the genius turn in his thinking that changes the way we look at economy?
Smith is not the first person who we would think of as doing economic thinking, anything like. But he is nevertheless the father of what I would call political economy, what he called political economy. And the reason for that is because he's the first person who takes all of these economic ideas and pulls them together into a comprehensive doctrine and then puts markets at the centre of economics. It's that move, it's the move to focus on markets that makes such a difference. And
what does he mean by markets?
Well,
is it just the same thing we mean today, or?
Well, of course, when you think about markets, then as now, you could be thinking about many different things. You could be thinking about the kind of market he would have seen in his coastal town of Kirkcaldy, where he grew up, on the east coast of Scotland, or you could be thinking about the market, the international markets for example, wool, which was a great source of wealth in Britain in the 14th century. And Smith's a great historian. One of the really important things about Smith is he does think historically. He has an idea. He has ideas that we think of now as being scientific, and we think of the way in which people use mathematics and economics today. In many ways, they're working out the implications of Smithian ideas. But of course, that's not really his view. His view is much more almost 21st century. It's much more ecological, it's much more dynamic, and it's much more infused with an understanding of markets that isn't just about conditions of exchange, as it were, you give me something, I give you something back, and we both benefit. It's interested in markets as embodied human constructs that are mediated by trust and social norms and values and tradition and all those other things. And when you adopt that viewpoint, the mathematics gets almost impossible. But actually, it's a much more interesting way of thinking about them. And what is fascinating about economics today is the way in which we keep having to discover Smithian insights by the back door, because the history of economics in the 19th and 20th century had kind of pushed them out of the front door altogether.
So trust is central here, of course.
Trust is absolutely central.
Yeah. And how is trust created then, from Smith's point of view?
First of all, people always think of Smith's great work as being The Wealth of Nations, 1776, and so it is. It's an absolute towering masterpiece. It's really one of the greatest works of social science ever written, I think without doubt. But he also wrote a book before that, in 1759, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which people rather ignore. Now, that's a work not of moral philosophy particularly, although there is some philosophy in it. It's a work of moral psychology. So it asks the question, the naturalistic, almost the scientific question, where do our social norms and our moral values come from? And, of course, if Smith had been a standard thinker of a kind of pre-Humean type, he would have been thinking of these norms and values as being something implanted in the human breast by God, as a matter of grace, or, as it were, reached through systematic study of the Gospels and the like. He doesn't think that. He thinks of our norms and values as coming from other people. So he says that just as human beings have a natural tendency to truck, barter and exchange in, as it were, their economic transactions, they have a natural tendency in their moral behaviour to seek he says, humans desire not merely to love, but to be lovely. That is the fit object of love in the eyes of others. So he sees our moral behaviour as essentially trying to elicit the admiration and esteem and respect of other people through our actions. And therefore, there's a public aspect to our actions where they're seen by others and we see them seeing our actions and we cue off them into, as it were, good mutual behavior. And that's turned out to be astonishingly influential. If you think about equilibrium theories of social norms, for example. And one of the things that does, I think, is to give Smith a very good claim to be not just the father of economics, but in many ways the father of social psychology as well. And we think of sociology as being something that comes in the 19th century, Comte, Durkheim, Weber, but actually I think in many ways it comes with Smith in the 18th century.
And this, actually, I mean, it's a quite astonishing psychological insight when you think of it, especially when you manage to systematize it, to put it to work in your work as well. So it's an insight, but it's also, you know,
I mean, it spools outwards. It gives you so much. Yeah. So one of the things that's really interesting about it is that, you see, it goes a long way to discharging this Humean idea of a science of man, because you can see human economic interaction as being about the exchange of goods and services.
Yes.
You can see human moral interaction as being about the exchange of esteem or regard. And that ties the two things together into a single theory. And I think that gives it tremendous power. It also does something that I think is very interesting because, of course, Smith thinks that in people's dealings with each other economically, in political economy, people have a natural desire to try to advance their situation. Not just a matter of personal greed, but the people around them, their families, their towns, their well-being. They want to do well. And they compete in order to do well. But, of course, he also thinks that that can lead to a materialism and the corruptions of being obsessed with, his great phrase is, trinkets of frivolous utility, things that don't do anything for you, but that just look good. You know, the third Porsche in the driveway is the kind of classic modern example of that kind of thing. You know, you just don't need it, it's irrelevant to anything, it's just showing off, really. And a lot of that happens in our economic lives. But then what's fascinating is he also thinks the same thing on the moral side. So he thinks that the natural human desire to look good in front of other people, it has as its counterpart a slavish admiration for the rich and the powerful. And of course, what's so interesting about that in a modern world of social admiration, Facebook, everyone competing with each other to look good, the price of a wedding going through the sky because everyone wants the one photograph against the infinity pool or the beach with the perfect dress and the setting sun. You know, that's all Smith. That's all, that social comparison and social competition is really Smithian in its instinct.
So, of course, these thoughts are quite radical at the time. And
they're radical now.
Yeah, and but what's the reception? So how is he perceived?
Well, when the Theory of Moral Sentiments comes out, he gets a marvellous letter from Hume, which I include in my book, in which Hume basically holds him off for an entire letter as to what the result's going to be. He says, you must ask me how, I'm sure you want to know how your book is doing. Oh, I've been interrupted. It couldn't be more annoying. And he goes through the whole thing. But let me come back to your book. Oh, another interruption. It's terribly funny. It's brilliant. He kind of strings him out. And then he says, I must tell you the very sad news, which is that your book has been a tremendous triumph, and in particular it's been very much admired by the bishops. He says, and you must judge for yourself how bad it has gone if it has been admired by these retainers to superstition, which is a classically, Hume's incredibly funny. Whenever I think the narrative needs a bit of a joke, I go to Hume, because he's just reliably hilarious. So the Theory of Moral Sentiments was a succès d'estime, sold well, but was not regarded as an international smash hit. The Theory of the Wealth of Nations does very well, but it's a big 2-volume expensive book. I don't know if you've seen it, the original. It's a marvellous thing. It's a beautiful book, and people have spent a lot of money to buy it. It takes a little while to catch on, but amongst people who know about these things, it is instantly regarded as a classic.
It's interesting today, of course, because we often, when we think of Smith, we often think of the Homo economicus as well, of course, and the sort of greedy, ruthless, pleasure-seeking economic man.
Yes.
But are we right to do so? Is that really a sort of Smithian way of thinking?
No, we're hopelessly wrong if we think that. And one of the reasons why the book's called Adam Smith, What He Thought and Why It Matters, is to try to use the what he thought part just to get away from some of these mad myths and encrustations of kind of foolish opinion, which we see. So when you look at Smith's overall prestige, his authority, and his influence are so great that it's rather like the kind of coast of, or the profile of Sicily. You go and you see a series of quite large mountains marked Marx and Hayek and people like that, Keynes, and then you get to Smith and he's Etna, and it's just vastly bigger. Yeah. So he has more citations, academic citations, than all of the other three put together. So when you have that much prestige, then, of course, you're constantly vulnerable, and Smith is himself constantly vulnerable to being appropriated, misused, abused, and deployed in support of every dodgy idea or half-baked theory advanced by a lobby group or a politician. And so it's really quite important to be clear about what he thought. And his thinking is so much more interesting and more complex than it's given credit for, that it's also really important because when we do understand what he's thinking, it turns out that he's thinking in a much more subtle and sophisticated way about problems we have today. We can go back to him and start using. He's one of the most contemporarily important economic thinkers we have even now, and we just don't realize it.
So if we take the economic man as a concept then and say, it's like, what would be the Smithian version of that? What would be the economic man according to him?
So there is no such thing as economic man. The Homo economicus is really a 19th century invention.
Yes.
And it comes out of a tradition that starts with Malthus and then Ricardo and then John Stuart Mill, which is all about trying to pare away, for very good social scientific reasons, from everything that's irrelevant and get simpler and simpler models of human behaviour, and in particular, models of human behaviour that people can treat mathematically.
Yeah.
And when you get to the marginalists in the 1870s, Walras, Jevons and Menger, they are using some quite sophisticated mathematics. They're using differential and integral calculus to explain what the marginal propensity to consume of a person is, and therefore at what level prices are set at the margin. And that's a mathematical treatment of an idea you find in Smith, in the idea of an equilibrium in a market. So that's important, and it's been very influential. But that mathematization takes us, and that Homo economicus, a person purely motivated by greed, hostile to work, naturally idle, and all the rest of it, that then becomes a cultural meme that seeps back into our culture, and it's completely un-Smithian. That's not how Smith thinks of it at all. Smith doesn't think of markets as disembodied, desiccated abstractions of mathematics. He thinks of them as embodied cultural artifacts rooted in history and subject to all those things of trust and norms and values that I described.
And that also maybe explains why he could be a good friend of Edmund Burke, which is fascinating. They were actually good friends.
They were.
And you've written on Burke as well. So,
yes. People who have a real appetite for pain can go back and read my earlier biography.
Yes, absolutely.
Edmund Burke. But they're interesting together because see, Burke is the hinge of our political modernity, certainly in Britain and in many Western countries, because Burke is the first person to give you a theory of political parties and representative government. And if you think about where democracy comes from, there are many ways of thinking about democracy. In the 20th century, we tend to think of it as the universal franchise. Often hasn't existed until very recently. We didn't have a fully universal franchise in Britain until after the Second World War, when the second seat in the university towns was abolished.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, people forget. I mean, women got the vote in 1928, 1918, then 1928. But but actually, that's not really the right way to think about democracy, I don't think. I think the way to think about democracy is it's the moment where you can change your government through a general election. And if you think about that, then that starts in Britain in the 18th century. And the most important moment is the period between 1765 and 1782, because in 1765, the Whigs, led by Lord Rockingham, are elected. They leave office in 1766. It's a very turbulent time. They then stay out of office as a coherent opposition political grouping, well-organised and with a coherent set of principles. They're not a faction, they're organised around principles, they're a party, and then they come back into power in 1782. That's the first time that ever happens in Europe, and it's an amazingly interesting moment, and it's really the foundation of political parties. And that theory of party and of representative government is what we get with Burke. And if you think about the countries that we would regard around the world as not being democratic, what they really lack is political parties. You know, you think of North Korea or Russia. I mean, Russia not really now, but semi, and China, of course. What they lack are really effective independent political parties.
We think of these two giants, Burke and Smith. In what way are they similar, and what sets them apart, would you say?
Well, what they have in common in many ways, I think, is a kind of small c conservative instinct. So an instinct for a deep analysis of politics and of economics, political economy, but also for reform over revolution and for understanding in a historical mode human nature, rather than cutting away from the past and just seeing it in terms of abstract principles. And Burke has a very strong critique of abstract principles and all the evils they can do, beginning from the very beginning of his life. So Burke has a marvellous moment where he essentially says in his first book, which is about aesthetics, he says, if someone starts talking, he has a section on language, if someone starts talking to you in abstract nouns, you're being rhetorically played. They're really picking your pocket. Isn't use quite this language? That language. They're basically, and that's true in politics now. When someone starts talking about truth, democracy, you know that they're putting one over on you. And Smith is also very strongly hostile to abstract ideas. Smith is very interested. And so when, for example, the physiocrats, who are the first great school of political economists in France, as it happens, under a man called François Quenet, when they get going, the whole critique that Smith makes of them is that they don't pay enough attention to how things are actually working. They're too utopian. And, of course, that leads them into horrible mistakes. They're agrarians. They think that the only source of human value is man's ability to till the land. Well, of course, roughly, I mean, that's tiny. It's a minuscule part of the economy. Now you think of technology and manufacturing and all the changes that we've had since then.
What can we learn from Adam Smith today, you think?
I think one of the things that's fascinating about Smith is that he isn't just the father of economics and a historically incredibly important figure. He's also completely relevant now. And let me just give you some examples of that. If we think now about the nature of capitalism, capitalism isn't an idea that exists in Smith's time. Because capitalism in its modern sense is really about the interaction between open markets, that is Smithian, and then large autonomous accumulations of capital. That's corporations. You don't really get corporations in Britain or America until the middle of the 19th century. In the old days, you had chartered corporations like the East India Company, and that's something on which Smith has a lot to say, and Burke has a lot to say, and Burke rather shapes Smith's thinking in many ways, and vice versa on this topic. But you don't have capitalism in that full 19th century sense. But even so, Smith has this astonishing theory of crony capitalism, which we can derive from his work. And that emphasizes three things that are endemic now in markets. So rent extraction, that's people basically trying to game the rules to reduce competition, to raise prices, to protect the insiders. Another would be the principal agent problem. We pay these people and they run off with our money within corporations. How often have you heard that? And then the third would be asymmetries of information and power. And you see that at the moment, quintessentially with the platforms, the online platforms, amazing amounts of insider power, amazing amounts of quasi-monopoly power. And how are we going to check that? And I think one of the things that Smith points us towards is a complete change to a 21st century competition policy. That would mean, empowering the consumer in order to level the playing field. It might mean breaking up some of these institutions. It would mean a much wider suite of tools to try to combat monopoly and oligopoly, because what really matters isn't this empty rhetoric of free markets. There really aren't any free markets, not now, and there haven't been many points in the past. Fewer than people think. It's really the reality of effective competition. That's what keeps people honest. That's what keeps prices low. That's what insists that, as it were, there is adequate supply and demand in a market to make it clear.
What do you think Adam Smith would say if he came back today and he saw the system he inspired?
I think he would think that it was, in one way, unrecognisably different from anything he could ever have imagined, and in another way, astonishingly similar. Because what would be different? Well, he doesn't really write or think about technology particularly. He doesn't, and yet technology has proven to be an enormous driver of economic and social well-being, and some negative well-being, and there's some ill and harm as well. And also, of course, he doesn't really have a theory of industrialization, and yet the world is massively industrialized. Indeed, in many cases, it's post-industrializing. So those things, I think he would regard as radically different. What is so interesting for him would be to look at that and say, actually, how these ideas in The Wealth of Nations have been used to explain even those things which didn't exist before, and also how much the basic instinct of man to do better on his own behalf, or woman to do better on her own behalf, if you like, and to exchange esteem as they exchange goods and services, how those have not changed at all. Human nature, evolves, but it doesn't change that much. And I think the thing, to take it slightly more abstractly, is, so Smith has a view of human society which develops in stages. And the great change in the 18th century, and the reason why I started with his time in Scotland, is because he's not just trying to explain this astonishing economic growth that makes Scotland the Asian tiger of the world economy at the time. He's also trying to explain how is it that people who had been a peasant economy only 50 years before he was born, even less, can become so polished and so sophisticated and so culturally developed and so socially developed. And he has a theory of stages in which humans go from hunting and shooting, if you like, or hunting and fishing, if you like, to pasturage, early agriculture, and then ultimately to what he calls commercial society. And it's that commercial society which marks the movement from one person being dependent on another, the local lord, the king or queen, the big boss, whatever it might be, the tribal elder, to a moment where every man, as he says, is in himself, as it were, a merchant and lives by exchanging. And we have a presumptive equality with each other. So Smith's social theory, it goes far beyond just thinking about the moral counterparts of markets. It goes into a whole theory of how society develops. And if he was looking now, I think he would say what is noticeable about the world today is that we're still in this society, commercial society. We're still in that place where people live by exchanging. We haven't changed from that, although it's radically different from what he would have imagined. And in a way, I think it's the recognition that we're still in commercial society that is so much a more interesting way to think about how we live today than capitalism. I think capitalism is in many ways a rather narrow idea, and we're struggling to understand its limitations in a world where capital is now becoming disembodied and economics itself is changing, it's becoming much more ecological and much more evolutionary, a very Smithian idea, by the way. Mm. Smith is one of the great founders of evolution before Darwin, who was a great student of Smith's, read a lot of Smith. So you don't just have a change in our mindset, you have us busting up against these categories of capitalism and trying to think beyond them. And I think if we get back to the idea of commercial society, we can start the process of rebuilding ourselves intellectually for the next generation. And one reason why that's important is because in capitalism, we don't have a theory, really, of why it matters that some people don't do well. We expect people will do well, but if some people don't, it's not an indictment. That's just the system is working in some way that it has not. But in commercial society has with it the idea of a theory of legitimacy. It's not working unless everyone is helped. Everyone does better. And when commercial society arose, Smith's point was precisely that everyone did better from the move out of feudalism into that society of exchange and of trade. And I think we have to get back to the idea that we have to lift all boats. We have to bring everyone with us. And that's a prerequisite for politics today. And if we can do that, we can get away from some of the division and tribalism that we see everywhere around the world.
Jesse Norman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.